She didn't beg. She didn't cry. When the Alpha King pointed at her in front of 10,000 wolves and called her nothing, Lyra Ashbourne stood straight as a blade and let him finish. That moment, that single humiliating breath in front of the entire kingdom, wasn't her end. It was the last time she ever let a man decide her worth. What happened next in the Dragonwild will shake everything you thought you knew about power, bloodlines, and what it really means to survive. Stay with me until the end, because this story doesn't go where you expect. And if you're watching from your city right now, drop it in the comments. I want to know where my people are. Hit like if you believe the ones they throw away are the ones who come back the hardest. The sacred bonding ceremony began at dusk, the way it always had. Torches driven into the frozen ground around the calling circle, smoke rising black and thick into a sky that held no stars that night. The Iron Fang Kingdom's Great Hall had been opened to the mountain air for the first time in a decade. Its iron doors pulled back so the whole of the royal court could stand witness on the steps. 10,000 wolves lined the descent from the palace down to the valley floor, rank after rank of soldiers, nobles, pack elders, and common blood, all pressed shoulder to shoulder in the cold. Lyra Ashbourne stood at the center of the calling circle alone. She had been there for 20 minutes already, waiting while the high ceremonialist finished his preparation, grinding the bone-white ash of the spirit root into the copper basin, drawing the sealing marks around the circle's edge with a brush made from wolf tail. She didn't move. She didn't fidget. Her boots were planted on the stone, her hands loose at her sides, her spine straight in the formal black ceremonial coat that had been sewn for her 3 weeks ago when the bonding date was first announced. It fit her well. She'd made sure of that herself, going back twice to the palace tailor and standing still for long measurements when most women in her position would have sent a servant. Details mattered. She had always believed that. She was 23 years old. She had spent 11 of those years in the palace, first as the ward of the Northern Ash clan after her parents died on a border raid, then as a council aide at 16, then as a tactical advisor at 19, a role no woman had held before her, and a role she had earned by walking into the war room uninvited and solving a supply crisis in the Eastern Corridor that 2 senior commanders had been arguing about for 6 months. She had laid the answer out on a map in 30 minutes. They tried to dismiss her. Lord Commander Bren had laughed. Then he'd looked at the map again. By the time Kaelin Draven noticed her, she had already become difficult to ignore. Their courtship, if it could be called that, had been a slow, angular thing. He was not a man who softened easily. He had grown up inheriting the Iron Fang tradition without apology, strength above sentiment, bloodline above affection, the pack before any single wolf. He had taken command of the kingdom at 18 when his father died of chest fever, and in 5 years he had expanded their territory, crushed 2 rival invasions, and consolidated the fractured northern packs under a single law for the first time in 2 centuries. He was respected in the way that a weapon is respected, by everyone who understands what it can do to them. But she had seen something else in him. She'd watched him in the war councils, the way he listened longer than people expected, the way he remembered small details about his men, the name of a soldier's sick daughter, the specific way a border captain liked to read a terrain map. There was a mind behind the iron. There was something that reached sometimes before the armor clamped back down. She had thought, foolishly, that it reached for her too. When he'd formally requested the bonding contract 8 months ago, she had accepted. Now she stood in the calling circle with her arms at her sides and the ash smoke curling around her ankles, and she listened to the ceremonialist begin the incantation, and she breathed. The spirit call was simple in theory. The ceremonialist would speak the binding words. The mate's wolf spirit would rise in response. Visible to all, a pulse of light and animal form that confirmed the bond was recognized by blood and pack law alike. Then the alpha would step into the circle. They would press hands to the copper basin together, and it was done. She had never had cause to doubt the ritual. She had never shifted in public. That was not unusual among women of non-warrior bloodlines. Her family had been northern border scouts, lean, quiet, more prone to strategy than display. The wolf was there. She had felt it since childhood, the low animal heat in her chest, the way the forest went sharp and detailed in her senses when she needed it to. It had simply never chosen to surface in open ceremony. It did not surface now. The ceremonialist spoke the words a first time. The torches flared in the wind. Around the circle, thousands of wolves held their breath. Lyra breathed slowly and waited for the warmth in her chest to answer, and felt nothing rise. Not nothing exactly. Something moved far below, like a current at the bottom of a frozen river, but it did not come up. The silence stretched. The ceremonialist spoke a second time, louder, the formal repetition that protocol required when there was no immediate response. Lyra kept her face still. She was aware of every eye on her. She was aware of the specific weight of Kalen's gaze from where he stood at the circle's edge, 15 feet away in full ceremonial armor, his expression doing the thing it did when he was deciding something. The second call produced nothing visible. A murmur began to move through the crowd, the way a crack moves through ice. First a sound, then a feeling underfoot. Ceremonialist, Kalen's voice. Quiet, but the kind of quiet that carries. The old man looked up from the basin. "My king." "Call it once more." The third call was spoken. It was longer than the others, each syllable enunciated with the full weight of the ritual's oldest form. Around the circle, the ash marks began to glow faintly in response to the invocation, pale gold lines that pulsed once, twice, and held. Lyra felt the current beneath her ribs thrash, suddenly, like something waking. For one instant, she thought, and then it was gone, sunk back, locked behind something she couldn't name. Nothing appeared. The silence after the third call was different. It was not the silence of waiting. It was the silence of conclusion. She heard Lord Vane say it first. He was standing at Kalen's right shoulder, the king's chief steward, a lean man with silver-streaked hair and a voice designed for rooms. He didn't shout. He simply said it at a volume that ensured it traveled. "No spirit. She has no wolf." It was not a question. It was an announcement. Kalen turned his head toward Vane slowly, the way he turned his head when he was deciding whether to be angry at someone, but he did not contradict it. He looked back at Lyra in the circle. "Lyra." His voice was careful, controlled. "Stand down from the circle." She didn't move immediately. Not out of defiance. She was processing what was happening, laying it out in her mind the way she'd learned to lay out tactical problems, looking for the pieces that didn't fit. Her wolf was there. She knew it was there. Whatever had failed tonight was a failure of surface, not of depth. She needed to say that. She needed to say it now, in front of all of them, before the narrative took hold. "Kalen." She said his name without title, which was technically her right as a bonded mate. "Let me speak. Stand down from the circle. There is something in my bloodline that isn't reading to the ritual correctly. That's not the same as having no wolf. I need you to let me speak before your court makes a decision based on... This isn't a council session." His voice dropped a register. The armor was all the way down now. "There is no argument to be made here. The call was given 3 times. Step out of the circle." She stepped out. He held her gaze as she crossed the ash mark line, and for 1 second, she thought she saw something move behind his eyes that wasn't iron. Something that looked, briefly, like a man who knew he was about to do a thing he couldn't take back. Then Lord Vane's hand touched his shoulder, and whatever it was, it closed. "My king," Vane said smoothly, with the particular warmth of a man enjoying himself. "The law is clear." "I know what the law says." Kalen looked away from her, addressed the court. His voice went out like a blade being drawn, clean, certain, no hesitation. "The sacred bond requires wolf recognition. There has been none. The contract between Lyra Ashbourne and the Iron Fang throne is hereby declared void." She had prepared herself, somewhere in the 3 minutes since the first failed call, for the possibility of something like this. She had not prepared herself for what came next. Furthermore, he paused. 1 breath. Under Iron Fang law, a woman who brings a false bonding before the throne endangers the kingdom's spiritual integrity. The ward of the Northern Ash clan is hereby stripped of her court title and her residency within the palace walls. She heard the crowd. She heard what 10,000 people sound like when they decide collectively that something is over. "You have until dawn," Kalen said. He was looking at the ground near her feet, not at her face. Pack what you can carry. You'll be escorted to the Ashen Mountain Road by second watch. Lyra Ashbourne stood in the dying torchlight with the ash circle behind her and did not move for a long moment. She was doing the thing she always did when the ground shifted, mapping what remained, who was standing where, what each face in the front rank of the crowd was doing. She saw Lord Vane's satisfaction, barely suppressed, the thin smile of a man whose long work had just paid off. She saw Lord Commander Bren, the one who had laughed at her map once, before he'd stopped laughing, looking at the ground with an expression she couldn't read. She saw Lady Soren, who had worked alongside her in the Eastern logistics effort for 2 years, turning away. She looked at Kylan one final time. He had turned his back. She walked out of the calling circle and through the parting crowd with her hands loose at her sides and her spine straight, the same way she had walked in. Yes, they gave her a room to pack in. Not her own. Her own quarters had already been sealed, she discovered, when she reached the residential wing and found the steward's lock on the door. A junior footman with avoidant eyes led her to a small receiving room on the ground floor and left a single oil lamp. Someone had thought to leave a canvas pack on the table, a small mercy or an efficiency. She didn't know which. She packed in the dark beyond the lamp's circle, by memory. She had lived in this palace 11 years and she knew exactly what mattered and what didn't. She took the worn leather journal she'd filled with territorial maps and supply notes. 5 years of work, irreplaceable. She took the small bone-handled knife her father had carried, which was worth nothing militarily, and everything else. She took a change of clothes, a wool undercoat, 2 pairs of heavy socks, a fire kit, and a compass that ran accurate in the northern highlands where the iron deposits messed with lesser instruments. She did not take the ceremonial coat. She sat on the edge of the bare table when she was done, and put her hands flat on the canvas of the pack and let herself have 60 seconds of the things she had not allowed herself in front of the court. It was not crying, exactly. It was more like a controlled demolition, feeling the full weight of what had been standing and letting herself understand that it was down. The betrayal. The public theater of it. The careful, deliberate choice of words Kaylin had used. Spiritual integrity, false bonding, words designed not just to remove her but to define her as a threat, a contamination, something the pack was better off without. Lord Vane's work. She was certain of it. The phrasing was too precise to be grief, too legally airtight to be anger. Someone had prepared that language in advance. Someone had known or arranged that the ceremony would fail. She gave herself 60 seconds. Then she stood up, shouldered the pack, and walked out of the room. No. The second watch escort was 4 soldiers she didn't know, not from the inner palace guard, which was intentional. Nobody who had worked with her. Nobody who might hesitate. They were professional and silent and walked her through the back gate of the palace complex down into the servants' road, avoiding the main thoroughfare where the crowd might still be dispersing. She noted that too. At the gate to the lower city, one of them spoke for the first time. The road east goes 40 miles to the mountain base. There's a way station at the 20-mile mark. After that, he stopped. He was young. He didn't want to finish the sentence. After that, it's the Ashen Mountain Pass, she said. I know the geography. Yes, ma'am. Don't. She said it without heat. You don't have to call me that. He nodded, said nothing else. They walked her to the outer wall, where the road began in the darkness beyond the last torch post, and they stopped there, at the edge of the light. She walked into the dark. The Ashen Mountains were named for the volcanic stone that made up most of their composition. Pale gray rock that in certain light looked white, in certain shadow looked like old bone. The mountain range ran east to west across the kingdom's northern edge, and beyond them was the Dragonwild territory, which no wolf claimed and no Iron Fang map detailed past its first 10 miles. Conventional wisdom held that the Dragonwild was hostile, harsh terrain, strange weather systems, and an atmosphere that did something to pack sense navigation, scrambling instincts that wolves relied on in open wilderness. Conventional wisdom also held it was empty. She reached the way station at dawn after a night of walking that she conducted with the focused detachment she usually reserved for long campaign marches. She didn't let herself think about the ceremony, or Kaylin, or Lord Vane's smile. She thought about terrain. She thought about her water supply. She'd found a stream at the 9-mile mark, and refilled the small canteen she'd packed. She thought about the rate at which her body temperature would drop once she cleared the mountain shoulder and hit the open highland wind. The way station was a single-room stone structure that stank of old ash and animal. There was a rusted iron box with 4 pieces of dried travel bread inside it, put there decades ago by someone who had believed in the way station's purpose, and never replaced. She ate 2 pieces. They were almost flavorless, closer to compressed dust than food, and rested for 2 hours with her back against the wall and the pack in her lap. The wolf in her chest moved again, in the rest. That deep current, the one that had refused to rise in the circle. In the silence of the way station, with no torchlight and no crowd and nothing but wind in the rock, she felt it more clearly than she had in years. It was not absent. It had never been absent. It was coiled around something old and dense and dormant, the way a vine grows around a buried stone, so intertwined that pulling one loose meant pulling the other. She didn't know what that meant yet. She pulled it over in her mind like a map with missing sections, tracing the edges of what she knew. Her mother's bloodline had been old northern blood, pre-kingdom formation, from the clans that had lived in these mountains before the Iron Fang consolidation. Her mother had never spoken much of it. At the time, Lara had not thought to ask why. She ate the second piece of travel bread, shouldered the pack, and started up the mountain. The pass through the Ashen Range took 2 days. The first was navigable, cold, exposed, the path clear enough if you read the rock formations correctly and didn't rely on pack sense to tell you where the stable ground was. She ate the remaining 2 pieces of bread on the first night, rationed, sitting in a rock alcove out of the wind with her wool undercoat pulled tight. The second day the weather came in. It was not a storm, exactly. It was the Ashen Mountain phenomenon she had read about in the territorial survey files she'd been given access to during her council work. A pressure system that rolled in off the highland plateau and reduced visibility to 10 feet, filled the air with fine, pale grit, and did something to sound that made it feel like the world had gone muffled and close. Wolves who attempted the pass in these conditions frequently turned back. 3 territorial surveys had been lost to it in the last century. She kept walking. She navigated by the compass, by the texture of the rock under her boots, and by the direction the wind was pushing the grit into her left cheek, which meant she was oriented northeast, which was correct. She couldn't see the path. She could feel it. She moved slowly, testing each step, and she talked to herself in a low, continuous murmur that was not for comfort, but for focus. The same way she used to talk herself through a complex supply problem in the war room, just audible enough to keep the thread of logic intact. Northeast bearing. Wind consistent. Rock slope is descending, which means I'm past the shoulder. The descent should take 4 hours in clear conditions, so estimate 6 to 8 in this. Hydration. Canteen at half. Temperature dropping, which is normal for descent into the Dragonwild Valley shadow. Keep moving. Keep the bearing. She came through the grit cloud at what she estimated was late afternoon of the second day. The air cleared in the space of 20 steps. One moment white and close, the next sharp and dark, and smelling of pine resin and wet stone and something else underneath it, something that was not wolf and was not any animal she had cataloged before. Rich and old and faintly electric, like the air before a lightning strike. She stood at the tree line on the Dragonwild side of the Ashen Range and looked down at a valley that the Iron Fang maps had marked as empty. It was not empty. The forest below was old growth, trees thick as tower columns, their canopy so dense it created a permanent half-dark at the valley floor. Through that canopy, in 3 separate places that she could see from her elevation, there was light. Not torchlight, deeper, warmer. The kind of light that moved with weight, like fire attached to something living. She was still processing what she was seeing when she heard movement in the trees below. Not the sound of an animal, the sound of something large moving with deliberate quiet, which was different and much more interesting. She did not run. She set the pack down at her feet, put her hands open and visible at her sides, and waited. 3 of them came out of the tree line. They were in human form, but the air around them was not entirely human. There was a shimmer at the edge of their silhouettes, like heat haze, and when the one in front moved his hand to signal a halt to the others, she saw the faintest trace of scale pattern in the skin of his forearm, dark and iridescent, before it disappeared. He was older than the other 2, White-haired, long-faced, with the kind of stillness in his bearing that came from decades of deciding whether things were threats or not. He looked at her for a long moment without speaking. She looked back. "You came through the mountain pass," he said finally. His voice was accented. "Not Iron Fang, something older. In the grit storm." "Yes." "Alone." "Yes." He studied her face. "Why?" She considered the honest answer and decided it was the only useful one. "Because they sent me this direction to die," she said. "So I decided to see what was out here." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile. More like a door that had been bolted from the inside, testing its hinge. "What pack?" he said. "Iron Fang, formerly." She let the word land. "My name is Lyra Ashbourne." "Elder Valor," he said. Not a question, an introduction. "You smell of wolf." He paused. "And something else." "I know." "Do you know what that something else is?" "No," she said, "but I've suspected for a while that the answer wasn't going to come from inside the Iron Fang kingdom." He was quiet again, doing the calculation she could see him making. The variables of who she was, why she was alive, what bringing her into the Dragonwild Valley meant, and what leaving her on the mountainside meant. She had done this calculation herself in the council rooms often enough to recognize the shape of it. "Come," he said finally. She picked up the pack. She followed the three of them down into the ancient dark of the Dragonwild, where the air smelled like lightning and old fire. And the trees were so large and old they had grown into each other overhead until the sky was something glimpsed through gaps, far above. Behind her, the Ashen Mountain Pass was already invisible in the dark. The Iron Fang Kingdom was on the other side of it, collapsing in slow motion under its own rot. She did not look back. She was halfway down the slope when she heard it, a sound that came from everywhere at once, low and resonant, like the valley floor itself was vibrating. Then she felt it in her chest. The buried thing, the coiled thing, the wolf that wasn't only wolf that had refused to answer 3 ritual calls in a ceremonial circle. Felt the sound and responded to it the way a banked coal responds to air. A heat she had never felt in her life moved through her sternum, down her arms to her fingertips, behind her eyes. Elder Valor stopped walking. He did not turn around, but she saw his shoulders change. "You felt that," he said. "Yes," she said. "Good." He started walking again. "Then we have a great deal to discuss." In the war room of the Iron Fang Palace, 11 miles away through rock and grit and altitude, Lord Vane stood at the iron table and watched the King's steward unroll the new territorial scroll. Kalen stood at the window with his back to the room, looking at the ashen range in the darkness. He had not spoken in some time. Vane cleared his throat. "The Ashbourne matter is resolved, my king. The road east has been confirmed closed behind her. By morning she will be in the pass, and the pass—" "I know what the pass does." Kalen's voice was low and flat. "Of course." A pause. "There is also the matter of the Northern Ash Clan's formal response. They are requesting an audience. Schedule it. And the bonding contract, it's void. You know it's void. Stop asking me about the bonding contract." Vane was quiet for a moment. He looked at the back of the king's head, the rigid set of his shoulders, the way his hands were braced on the window frame. There were things, Vane reflected, that were easier to arrange when the subject was not in the room. The king's uncertainty, when visible, was inconvenient. "There is a strategic concern," Vane said carefully. "The Ashbourne woman, whatever her bloodline limitations, she was effective. The council work, the Eastern supply route, she's gone." The king's voice closed around it. "There are other advisors." "Certainly." Vane folded his hands behind his back. "I only mention it because the Eastern Corridor situation is escalating. 3 new incursions in the last cycle, and certain of our intelligence contacts have been," he chose the word with care, "less responsive." Kalen turned from the window. His face was unreadable in the way that it got when he had made a decision he didn't fully trust and was not prepared to revisit. "What contacts?" "The Thornback informant, the one Ashbourne handled directly." Vane's expression was a careful blank. It seems she had her own arrangement with him, one we don't have visibility into. The king stared at him for a moment. You're telling me the woman we just exiled was the handler for our most reliable Eastern intelligence asset? I'm telling you, Vane said smoothly, that it's a situation we'll need to address. With new personnel, of course. Kaelin looked at him for a long moment with an expression that Vane, for the first time in many years in the king's service, could not categorize. Then Kaelin walked past him out of the war room without speaking. In the silence, the scroll on the iron table was very still. Outside the high window, the Ashen Mountains sat dark and impenetrable against the sky. Somewhere beyond them, in a valley that appeared on no Iron Fang map, something ancient was waking up, and no one in the palace knew to be afraid of it yet. The fire inside the great hall of the Forbidden Dragon Pack was not built in a hearth. It burned in the open center of the space, a natural stone bowl worn smooth by centuries of use, and the flame that lived in it was not fed by wood. It was fed by breath. Lyra understood this when she watched one of the younger pack members lean down and exhale slowly into the coals, and the fire answered by rising 3 feet and shifting color, blue at its base deepening to orange at its crown. She filed that away without comment, the way she filed everything, observed, categorized, not yet interpreted. Elder Valor had given her food first. Dried meat, hard bread, a clay cup of something hot and bitter that cut through the mountain cold in her chest better than anything she'd had in 2 days. She ate without embarrassing herself, which meant she ate at a controlled pace despite the fact that her body wanted to inhale everything on the plate. He watched her do it with the patient expression of a man who was performing an evaluation and did not feel the need to conceal this. When she finished, she set the cup down and met his eyes. "Go ahead," she said. "You don't know what I'm going to ask. You're going to ask why the Iron Fang Kingdom sent me through the Ashen Pass instead of simply removing my title and expelling me to another pack's territory. Because the answer to that changes what I am to you." He was quiet for a moment. "Does it? If I was expelled, I'm a refugee. Usable, maybe, but fundamentally dependent. If I was sent to die, that's a different conversation. That means someone in the Iron Fang court wanted me gone permanently, which means I knew something, or I was something, that permanent removal was the only solution for." "And which is it?" "Both," she said. "I just don't know the full shape of the second part yet." He looked at her for a long moment. The fire between them shifted color again. Nobody had breathed into it, but it moved anyway, slow and alive, tracking some current she couldn't detect. "Your mother's name," he said. "Sarah Ashbourne, born Sarah Veldis, Northern Clan. She died when I was 12. Veldis." He said the name the way you say a word in a language you haven't spoken in years, with the specific care of something pulled from deep storage. "The Veldis line has not produced a living heir in nearly 2 centuries. We believed it was extinct." Lyra kept her breathing even. "Evidently not. The dormancy in your wolf spirit, it isn't weakness, it isn't absence." He leaned forward, and in the firelight she could see the faint iridescence at his temples that the 2 younger pack members also carried. Scale pattern, nearly invisible at rest, a shimmer rather than a surface. "It's compression. The Veldis bloodline carries something underneath the wolf, something older. When the 2 are layered that way, the outer form goes quiet, waiting for the inner one to wake." She had known, somewhere below conscious thought, that this was approximately true. She had known it in the mountain pass when the cold and the grit and the exhaustion had stripped everything back to her bare moving body, and she'd felt the buried current more clearly than she ever had in the comfort of the palace. She had known it in the way station. She had known it, perhaps, since childhood, in the way that certain truths live in the body years before the mind is willing to look at them directly. "What is the inner form?" she said. Valor smiled. It was the first time she'd seen his face do that. It changed him, made him look briefly like someone who had been waiting a long time for a specific conversation. "That," he said, "is what we are going to find out." The finding out was not fast, and it was not gentle. And it was not anything like the careful structured world she had built for herself in the Iron Fang Palace over 11 years. The Forbidden Dragon Pack's territory ran deep into the Dragonwild Valley, farther than she had estimated from the ridgeline, the valley folding back on itself in ways that the Ashen Mountain's shadow concealed from outside observation. There were perhaps 300 of them, maybe slightly more, living in a settlement that was partly built and partly grown, structures that incorporated the living trees rather than replacing them, platforms and walls that had been shaped over generations until the line between architecture and forest was almost invisible. They were not primitive. Their metalwork was extraordinary. She saw tools and weapons and structural fittings that showed a sophistication she would not have associated with a pack the Iron Fang Kingdom had marked as legend and left off the maps. She asked Valor about it on her third day while he was walking her through the settlement's edge. "Why does the kingdom believe you don't exist?" "Because we stopped correcting them." He moved a low branch aside without slowing. 40 years ago, we were visible enough. There was a period of contact, trade, some territorial negotiation. Then the Iron Fang court under Kalen's grandfather decided that the Dragonwild represented an expansion opportunity. He paused, and she heard the weight in the pause. They sent 3 survey parties. None of them returned. After that, the kingdom revised its maps and called the territory cursed. It was easier than admitting what the survey parties had encountered. What did they encounter? He looked at her sideways. Us. Being clear about our position. She filed that under things she already suspected. The training began in the first week, and it began with something she hadn't expected. Stillness. Valor sat her in the old growth at the valley's deep center, where the trees were so ancient their roots were visible above ground in great knotted arches, and he told her to stop trying to find her wolf. "You've been reaching for it your whole life," he said, "trying to surface it, present it, make it visible to people who needed proof. Every time you did that, you pushed it down further. It is not a performance. It is not a credential. Stop treating it like one." "I wasn't," she started. "You were." No heat in it, just fact. "You spent 11 years in a court that measured everything by display. Who shifted fastest, who ran farthest, who showed the most visible power at the bonding circle. You absorbed that. You became very good at it, actually, showing competence in ways the court could categorize. But what's inside you doesn't categorize. It never did. That's why it went quiet." She sat with that for a long moment in the deep silence of the old growth, the tree roots around her like the rib cage of something enormous, the air smelling of lightning and wet earth. "So what do I do instead?" she said. "Stop," he said, "and wait. And when it moves, don't direct it. Follow it." She had never in her adult life been good at waiting without a plan attached. This was, she reflected grimly, probably the point. 6 weeks in, something shifted. She was running a training course with 2 of the younger Dragon Pack members, Rael, who was 20 and moved like falling water, and a woman named Cass who was built like a siege weapon and had the specific humor of someone who had survived a great deal. The course was designed to test combat instinct rather than train technique, uneven terrain, moving obstacles, simulated pressure from multiple directions. Lyra had been holding her own on technique. 11 years in the Iron Fang court had included military training, and she had taken it seriously. But Rael kept getting inside her guard on the left side, and she couldn't close it. On the 7th run, when Rael came at her left again, she stopped trying to correct with her training. She just moved. Her body took her somewhere she hadn't told it to go. Lower, angled, weight shifted in a way that wasn't Iron Fang combat doctrine. She felt the heat in her chest drop, not rise, sink deeper, go denser. And her left hand came up not to block but to redirect, and Rael went past her and hit the ground, and she was already turned to face the next angle before he landed. Cass, who had stopped on the course to watch, let out a low whistle. "What was that?" Rael said from the ground. Lyra looked at her hands. They looked the same, but the air around them had done the things she'd seen around Valor's and Rael's and Cass's silhouettes. A shimmer at the edge, brief and iridescent, like heat haze with structure. "I don't know," she said honestly. "Yes, you do," Cass said. "You just don't have a word for it yet." She earned words for it slowly, over months. The Dragon Pack did not have a manual. Their knowledge was passed the way most real knowledge was passed, through doing, through watching, through the specific embarrassment of failing in front of people who were patient enough not to make it smaller than it was. She failed a great deal. She failed at things she had been competent at before, because competence built on the wrong foundation sometimes has to come down before it can be rebuilt correctly. There were weeks where she hated the valley, hated the ancient trees, hated the particular way Valor said nothing when she expected correction, as if her mistakes were hers to examine alone. She examined them alone. It was not comfortable. It was, she came to understand, the entire point. 10 years passed in the Dragon Wild the way years pass when you are too busy surviving and then building to count them correctly. In accumulations rather than increments. The first year she learned to stop reaching. The second she learned to follow. By the third she was leading small training groups, not because Valor assigned it, but because the younger pack members started deferring to her instinctively, and she had learned enough about how instinct worked to understand that it was worth paying attention to. She became, without planning to, a tactician for a pack that had not needed one in decades. The Forbidden Dragon Pack had survived on concealment and the specific deterrence of being more dangerous than anyone wanted to test. But the eastern edge of the Dragon Wild was being probed, incrementally, by rogue alpha factions. Dispossessed wolves from collapsed packs, some mercenary, some ideologically committed to the idea that unclaimed territory was a moral category rather than a geographic one. She began tracking their movements. She drew maps that made Valor's maps look like sketches. She developed an intelligence network out of the pack's existing contact points. Traders who came as far as the mountain base, a handful of displaced neutral wolves who lived in the territory's border zone and owed the Dragon Pack old debts of protection. By her 5th year she knew, through this network, that the Iron Fang Kingdom was in serious trouble. The corruption Kaelin had allowed, or been maneuvered into allowing, she was honest enough to acknowledge the distinction, had metastasized. 3 senior nobles had been exiled and 2 had died in circumstances that no official account had adequately explained. Lord Vane had consolidated influence in the War Council to a degree that made him, effectively, the kingdom's operational power. Kaelin still held the throne nominally, but the decisions flowing from it no longer had his particular texture. She recognized it immediately because she had spent years reading the texture of his decisions from the inside. She sat with that intelligence for a long time before she said anything to Valor about it. "You've been waiting for me to bring this to you," she said one evening, in the 3rd week after she'd confirmed the Vane situation through 2 separate sources. Valor looked up from the bowl he was carving. He carved things in the evenings, simple shapes. She'd stopped finding it incongruous months ago. "I've been waiting for you to decide what to do with it. It's not my kingdom. No. I was expelled from it, publicly, with language specifically designed to make re-entry legally and socially impossible. Yes. The man who expelled me is currently losing it to someone who engineered the expulsion in the first place. Also, yes." She looked at the fire. "You don't think I'm going back for him?" "No." Valor set the carving down. "I think you're going back because Lord Vane's network is pushing east, and the eastern push eventually reaches the Dragonwild border, and you have spent 10 years building something here that you are not willing to lose. I think the Iron Fang Kingdom is the problem between you and the thing you've built, and you're deciding how to address the problem." He looked at her steadily. "That's different from going back for a man." She was quiet for a moment. "It requires an army," she said. "You have 300 warriors who've watched you work for 10 years. That's not an army." "No," he agreed. "But the neutral wolves on the eastern border, the ones who've been taking your intelligence reports and occasionally your protection, 8 packs, maybe 1,200 fighters if you count the secondary ranks, and the collapsed southern packs who've been sending you information in exchange for supply routes through Dragonwild territory." She had not told him about those contacts. She looked at him. He almost smiled. "You thought I didn't know?" "I thought you were allowing me operational latitude. I was doing both." He picked up the carving again. "The question isn't whether you have enough to move. The question is whether you move before Vane's eastern forces reach the border and choose the ground for you, or after." She knew the answer. She had known it for 3 weeks, since the first confirmed report on Vane's expansion timeline. Moving after meant fighting on ground someone else had chosen, with supply lines already compromised and the border packs, her border packs, the ones she'd spent years cultivating, caught between two advancing forces. Moving before meant marching on the Iron Fang Kingdom before they knew she was coming, before they knew she existed in any form they would recognize. She stood up. "I need a week to send riders to the southern packs," she said, "and I need Rael on the eastern border observation post until we move. I want real-time intelligence on Vane's forward units. Done. And I need—" She stopped. What? She thought about what she needed and understood that it was not a tactical resource. It was a decision she had been holding at arm's length for the 3 weeks since the intelligence came in, and she could not hold it any longer because the holding had become its own kind of preparation. She had left the Iron Fang Kingdom with a canvas pack, a compass, a bone-handled knife, and 60 seconds of controlled grief. She was about to go back to it, commanding a force that would fold it or break it or reshape it beyond recognition, and she needed to know, standing here in the firelight of a valley that had made her before she walked back out through the Ashen Pass, she needed to know what she was going back as. Not as the woman who had stood in the calling circle with her spine straight. Not as the ward of the Northern Ash Clan, or the tactical advisor, or the almost bonded mate. She was going back as whatever the Dragonwild had built from the raw material of all of that. And it was not something that could be undone, or apologized for, or managed with legal language by a man who had already turned his back once. She breathed in slow and felt the heat in her chest. Not below her ribs anymore, not a buried current, not a compression. It was sitting at her sternum like a coal in a banked fire, present and ready and waiting for air. "Nothing," she said. "I have what I need." She walked out of the firelight to send the first riders. Behind her, in the stone bowl at the center of the great hall, the flame rose 3 feet and held. The riders went out before dawn. Lyra sent 6 of them, 2 to the southern packs, 2 to the eastern border observation posts, and 2 to the neutral wolf settlements in the territory's rim zone who had been taking her supply route access in exchange for information and occasional discretion. The messages were short and specific. She did not use the word army. She used the word assembly, and she gave a location and a date 3 weeks out, and she signed nothing because the riders themselves were the signature. Dragon Pack runners were recognizable by their pace and their silence and the particular iridescence at the edge of their skin in certain light, and anyone who had been doing business with her long enough to matter would know what an assembly request from the Dragonwild meant. She spent the 3 weeks in preparation that was partly logistical and partly something harder to name. She ran the eastern terrain maps until she could draw them from memory in the dark. She worked through the order of march with Rael, who had come back from the border post with fresh intelligence on Vane's forward unit positions. 3 encampments in the lowland approach to the Dragonwild border, not yet aggressive, probing. She trained every morning with Cass until her body stopped hesitating at the transitions between forms, the wolf, and the deeper thing learning to move as one rather than in sequence. She slept 4 hours a night and did not dream of the palace. The assembly came together at the valley's eastern mouth, 1,140 fighters from 7 packs, plus the 300 of the Dragon Pack's own warriors, plus a forward scout unit of 40 that Lara had been running herself for 2 years, and that answered directly to her. The neutral wolf packs came wary and armed and assessed her with the specific measuring look of wolves who had been abandoned by enough institutions to need personal evidence before they committed. She gave it to them. She stood on a flat rock above the assembly and did not make a speech. She laid out the tactical situation, Vane's eastern advance, the timeline, the choke points, the 3 contingency scenarios she'd mapped for the approach to Iron Fang territory. And she answered questions directly, and did not soften the difficult answers. When a pack commander from the southern settlements named Orin asked what they were fighting for, since the Iron Fang Kingdom had shown none of them any particular loyalty, she said, "You're fighting for the eastern corridor and the supply routes through it. When Vane controls the lowland approach, he controls the trade access. You know what that means for your winter stores?" Orin looked at her for a long moment. "And you?" She met his eyes. "I'm fighting for the same territory you are, and because I know what's on the other side of Vane's advance, and you don't yet, and I'd rather go through it with 1,400 fighters than find out after the fact with 300. He nodded once. That was enough. The march began 2 days later, north and west through the highland route that bypassed Vane's forward encampments. A longer approach, harder terrain, but it kept them invisible to the encampment scouts until they were well inside the territory. Lyra rode with the forward scout unit and slept in the field like everyone else, which she had learned years ago was worth more to a fighting force than any formal authority structure. You could not lead wolves from behind. Not real wolves. Not the kind that would die for something. On the 4th day of March, Rael found her at the morning halt. His face was wrong. She read it before he spoke. The specific wrong of someone carrying information they have not decided how to deliver, which usually meant the information was the kind that changed things structurally rather than tactically. "Report," she said. "We have a problem." He paused. The Thornback Informant. The Thornback Informant was the Eastern intelligence contact she had been running for 8 years, the same one, she had long understood, that she had been handling for the Iron Fang court before her expulsion, whose existence Vane had used to illustrate her indispensability to a king who had already decided to remove her. She had re-established contact in her 3rd year in the Dragonwild, quietly, through the border zone traders, and had been running him independently since. He was her deepest source inside the Iron Fang court. He was the reason she knew about Vane's consolidation, the Eastern advance timeline, the internal council dynamics, the specific texture of information that had no other source. "What happened?" she said. "He's dead." Rael held her gaze. "Found at the lowland way station 2 days ago. Signs of a fast death, not a fight. Someone who knew where to be and when." She breathed in slowly through her nose. "Who knew his location?" "On our side?" Rael's jaw was tight. "You, me, Elder Valor, the 2 southern riders you sent 3 weeks ago." She worked through it without speaking. The riders had carried no written intelligence. She never committed source locations to paper. They had carried assembly requests, nothing more. But riders talked. Riders stopped at waypoints. Riders were sometimes, despite their training, not entirely careful about what they said, and to whom, in the particular vulnerability of a long road and a warm fire. "Which 2 riders?" she said. "Davin and Mira." He watched her face. "They came back clean. I checked them both myself when they returned. No contact with anything that looked like Vane's network." "Davin has a brother," she said, "in the lowland settlements, not Dragon Pack. He took a mate there 6 years ago." Rael was very still. "I knew about it," she said. "I considered it when I assigned the riders, and I decided the family connection was manageable. I was wrong." She said it flat and factual, the way she always delivered a tactical error assessment. The wrongness of it would live with her later, in the dark and the quiet. Right now it was a variable in a changed equation. "Does Devon know what he gave up?" "I don't think so. Not intentionally." Rael's voice was careful. "I think he talked to the brother. I think the brother is inside Vane's network, maybe without even knowing the full shape of it. One conversation, the wrong detail, the wrong set of ears at the right moment." She looked out at the highland terrain ahead of them. Gray rock, pale scrub grass, the distant western ridge where the Iron Fang Kingdom's eastern border ran. 1,400 fighters behind her who were committed based on an intelligence picture that was now partially compromised. "Vane knows someone is moving," she said. "Probably." "He doesn't know it's me." "Almost certainly not. Nobody outside our own people knows who built the Dragon Pack's fighting force. The Thornback contact knew pieces. Enough to confirm the army exists, probably. Maybe the eastern approach route." She turned that over. The eastern approach route was the problem. She had chosen it specifically because it bypassed the encampment positions, and if Vane now had the route, the encampments would reposition to cover it. They would arrive at the Iron Fang border at a choke point that was no longer empty. She needed to know how fast the repositioning had happened. "Pull the 2 forward scouts from the Highland Pass approach," she said. "Send them low, through the scrub line. I need eyes on the eastern encampment positions by tomorrow morning. And if they've moved, then we adjust." She looked at him. Go." He went. She stood alone on the hillside for 4 minutes. She counted them because she had learned that standing alone with a changed situation for a measured time was more productive than moving immediately, that the impulse to act before understanding was how good plans became catastrophes. She let the information settle. She let herself feel the specific weight of a loss she had not protected against. The Thornback informant had been 8 years of careful cultivation. He had known her methods, her timelines, her approach to source management. His death was not just an intelligence gap, it was a message. Someone had found him, which meant someone had been looking, which meant Vane's network was more active in the eastern border zone than her intelligence had indicated. That meant the intelligence picture she had been working from was incomplete in at least one direction she hadn't mapped. The scouts came back the following morning with the news she had been expecting and not wanting. The eastern encampment had repositioned overnight. 2 of the 3 units had moved north, covering the Highland Pass approach with enough coverage to make it a killing ground. The 3rd had moved to the lowland junction. Not aggressive, not attacking, but placed with the specific geometric precision of a force that had been told exactly where to be. Oren found her when she was looking at the repositioned positions on the terrain map. "They knew we were coming," he said. He was not asking. They knew someone was coming. They don't know who or how many. She tapped the lowland junction position. If they knew the full picture, this unit would be twice that size and positioned differently. This is a response to a partial intelligence report. How partial? Partial enough that we still have options. She straightened. But not the options I planned for. He looked at the map, at the repositioned units, at the Highland Pass, which was now covered. He was doing the calculation she had already done. The approach route was burned, the timeline was compromised, and the force she had assembled was committed. There was no walking 1,400 wolves back through the Dragonwild without the Southern Packs concluding she had led them into an intelligence failure, which she had, and the alliance dissolving before it had done anything. "What are the options?" Oren said. 1. She pointed to the map. "We stop pretending we're a covert force and move as a visible one. Full formation, direct western approach, use the lowland junction units repositioning as evidence of their awareness. Make it work for us instead of against us. They'll see us coming from 40 miles. Yes. And alert the full Iron Fang force. Also yes." She looked at him. "But they already know someone is coming. The advantage of surprise is gone. The only remaining advantage is size and commitment. 1,400 fighters moving openly and fast is harder to stop than 1,400 fighters moving carefully through a route that's been compromised." Oren looked at the map for a long time without speaking. She could feel the weight of his calculation. The Southern Pack lives in this coalition. The supply route access they'd been promised. The risk profile of a direct approach versus the intelligence failure risk of the route they'd planned. "You said you had 3 contingency scenarios," he said finally. "This is contingency 3. What are 1 and 2? 1 was the eastern approach working cleanly. 2 was a partial compromise requiring route modification." She held his gaze. 3 is this. He nodded once, the same way he had nodded at the assembly. "When do we move?" "Dawn tomorrow, full formation." She rolled the map. "Tell your commanders." He went. She stood alone again for a moment. Not 4 minutes this time, not a measured pause. Just one breath, in and out, because what she was about to do was remove the last possibility of approaching this situation quietly, and in removing it, she was committing to something that could not be uncommitted. She breathed out. The following dawn, she stood at the front of the formation in the black dragon armor that Cass had helped her fit 3 years ago. Articulated scale pattern plates that moved with her, light enough to run in, dense enough to stop most things. And she looked back at 1,400 wolves and 30 Dragon Pack warriors and 40 forward scouts, and she felt the heat in her chest drop to its lowest, densest point. Not fear. Something older than fear. The specific gravity of understanding that this road, walked, meant every version of the life before it was permanently behind her. There was no going back as the woman who had stood in the calling circle. There was only going forward as what the valley had built. She turned to face west and started walking. Behind her, 1,400 sets of boots hit the ground in the same moment. The lowland junction unit, 6 miles ahead, saw them coming in the gray light and sent a rider back toward the Iron Fang Palace at full speed. In the war room of the palace, the rider arrived at mid-morning and delivered his report to the man standing at the iron table. Not Lord Vane, who was traveling with the Northern military delegation, but Lord Commander Bren, who had held this post for 23 years and had seen a great many things, and had, on one notable occasion, laughed at a young woman's map until he read it twice. He read the rider's report twice. Then he sent for the king. Kalen arrived in the war room still in his morning training clothes, which meant he had been in the yard and was not pleased about being pulled from it. He read the report standing up. "Dragon armor," he said. "Yes, my lord." 1,400 fighters, direct approach. The rider counted the front formation, estimated remainder. Bren's voice was flat. "My lord, the scale pattern on the armor. Our rider says he's never seen construction like it. The lead figure—" He stopped. Kalen looked up from the report. "What?" Bren was quiet for a moment with the expression of a man deciding whether to say a thing that could not be unsaid. "The lead figure is female, my lord. Black armor, no insignia. Walking point on a 1,400-man advance." He met the king's eyes. "The rider says she moves like she knows exactly where she's going." The war room was very still. Kalen set the report down on the iron table. "Get me my commanders," he said. "My lord, now." Bren went. Kalen stood at the table alone and looked at the report, and felt something move in him that was not tactical and was not clean and was not anything he had allowed himself to feel in 10 years of being very deliberate about what he allowed himself to feel. He pressed both hands flat on the iron table and looked at the map. 1,400 fighters, female commander, dragon armor, approaching from the Dragon Wild. The Dragon Wild where they had sent her to die. He stood there for a long time in the empty war room with the morning light coming through the high window and the map of his crumbling kingdom spread under his hands, and he understood, the way you understand something that your body has known longer than your mind has been willing to, that whatever was coming toward him from the east was not going to be stopped by his commanders, and that he was not entirely certain, standing here alone, that it should be. The lowland junction unit did not hold. Lyra had not expected it to. They were a repositioned force, moved fast, without proper supply establishment, sitting on ground they hadn't chosen and hadn't had time to fortify. When the formation came over the ridge and they saw the full count, the unit commander made the correct professional decision and pulled back toward the main Iron Fang line rather than spending his people on a position that would not hold anyway. She watched them go through the forward scout's field glass and felt nothing in particular about it. It was the right call. She would have made the same one. What mattered was the ground they left behind. The lowland junction opened onto a wide, flat approach. 2 miles of open terrain before the first Iron Fang defensive line, which Bren would be building right now with whatever he had available. 2 miles of open ground was not ideal. It was also not a killing field if you moved across it fast and in formation rather than strung out and cautious. She gave the order and the formation went to march pace, not running but not walking either. The specific sustained rhythm that covered ground without burning out legs that might need to fight at the end of it. She ran the front. Rael was on her left, Cass on her right, and the Dragon Pack's 30 warriors were distributed through the formation rather than grouped, deliberately, because the shimmer effect of Dragon Pack fighters in combat had a specific psychological impact on enemies who hadn't encountered it before, and distributing them meant that impact was not localized but spread across the entire enemy line of sight. She had not told Orin about that particular tactical decision. She told him afterward, when he had already seen it work, which was the correct order. The first Iron Fang defensive line appeared at the 2-mile mark, hastily built, which was visible in its structure, but built by Bren, which meant it was built correctly within its limitations. Earthwork barriers, shield wall, archers on a slight elevation to the north. She assessed it in the time it took her to cover 50 yards at march pace. "Rael," she said without turning. "North elevation, 20 fighters, angled approach, hit the archers before we reach the barrier." "Done." He peeled off with his unit. "Cass." "Already moving." Cass had read the barrier structure the same way Lyra had. She took her unit left, toward the barrier's south end where the earthwork thinned. a forced construction shortcut that Bren's people had taken because they were building fast. Lyra kept the center formation moving straight at the shield wall. What happened in the next 4 minutes was loud and close and ugly in the specific way that real fighting is always ugly. Not the clean, coordinated violence of a training course, but the compressed chaos of bodies and noise and decisions made in fractions of seconds. The shield wall held for 90 seconds before Cass's unit hit its southern end and folded it. The archers on the north elevation broke when Rael's fighters came up the slope faster than the angle suggested was possible. Dragonpack fighters moved differently in real terrain, and enemy forces encountering it for the first time consistently underestimated the approach speed. She went through the center of the broken shield wall herself, not because the Alpha needed to be in the front, but because the center had 2 fighters who had not broken with the rest. Experienced soldiers holding their ground by discipline alone, and the fastest resolution was direct. She took the first one low and the second one at the shoulder, and neither engagement lasted more than 10 seconds. And she came through the line with blood on her left gauntlet that was not hers and moved without pausing. The first line was down in under 5 minutes. She stopped on the other side of it and let herself breathe for 30 seconds while the formation reorganized. Her ribs were fine. Her left shoulder had taken a hit from the second soldier's elbow that was going to bruise badly by morning. She rotated it experimentally, felt the specific sharp complaint of deep muscle impact rather than structural damage, and filed it. Rael came back to her position. His face had the bright-eyed look of a man in a fight he was winning. Second line is 2 miles north, bigger. Bren had time. How much bigger? Scout estimate 600, proper position. They had since dawn. She had expected this. Bren was not vain. Bren was a real soldier, which meant that once he had time, he built things correctly, and 600 on a proper position was a serious problem even for 1400 on offense. The math was not comfortable. Formation rest, she said. 10 minutes, water, then we move. Orin appeared at her side while the formation rested. He had blood on his face from a cut above his eyebrow. She could see it was shallow, the kind that bled freely without being serious, and he was ignoring it with the practicality of someone who had done this before. 600, he said. Yes. We've taken casualties, 30 down, maybe 40. Another 20 who will need to be pulled to the rear. She had already run those numbers. We still have the count advantage. Against a proper position. Against a proper position. She looked at him directly. Orin, if you need to pull your people back, tell me now. I'll adjust the formation and cover your withdrawal. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she recognized, the one that people got when they were deciding whether to be angry at the question or honest about the answer. My people don't pull back, he said. Good. She turned to Rael. 10 minutes. The second line was as advertised. Bren had positioned on a slight ridge, not dramatic elevation, but enough to matter, with the 600 arranged in a proper layered formation, shield wall at the front, a second rank behind with long weapons, and a reserve that she could see was being held back deliberately. The deliberate reserve was the tell. Bren was planning for a long engagement, which meant he expected to absorb the initial assault and counterattack into the formation's exhausted front. It was the right plan. It was what she would have done with 600 on defense against a tired offensive force. She had to make it wrong. We don't hit them in waves, she said to her commanders. The 6 of them grouped around her on the plain below the ridge, while the formation held position a quarter-mile back. Single, concentrated push, everything we have aimed at the center, not the wings, not the flanks, the center, where the reserve feeds forward. We collapse the center, and the wings have nothing to anchor to. We'll take casualties, one of the Southern Pack commanders said. Yes. She didn't soften it. Front rank will take the worst of it. I'll be in the front rank. He looked at her. That's not bravery, she said. That's physics. A front rank that sees its commander behind it moves differently than one that sees her ahead. We need the first push to be fast and committed and not hesitate at the impact. I can make that happen from the front. I can't make it happen from behind. She saw him work through it, the logic of it, the cost of it, what it meant to commit to a push like this with the Alpha at the point. On your call, he said. The formation moved up to 500 yards. She took position at the center front, Rael and Cass flanking her, and the 30 Dragon Pack fighters distributed through the first two ranks. She looked at the ridge ahead, the 600, the shield wall, Bren's careful layered defense. She looked at the sky above it, gray and flat, the kind of sky that holds no drama and makes the ground below it very clear and very final. She thought briefly and without sentiment about what it had cost to be standing here. The 11 years in the palace, the 60 seconds in the empty receiving room, the 2 days in the Ashen Pass, the 10 years of building something from nothing in a valley that didn't appear on any map, everything that had been taken and everything she had built in the space that taking had left. The cost of all of it was not an abstraction in this moment. It was a specific weight in her chest alongside the heat of the buried fire, and she did not push it away or compress it. She let it sit there. Let it be real. Because the things you carry honestly are lighter than the things you pretend you've put down. She breathed out once. "Move," she said. The formation came off the plain at full pace. The first 60 yards were quiet. The specific charged silence of two forces watching each other close the distance, each one past the point of decision and waiting for the collision. Then the Iron Fang archers on the ridge loosed, and the noise began, and it didn't stop. She went into the shield wall like something that had decided the shield wall was not a real obstacle. The heat in her chest went to its floor-level density, the deep anchor point, and her body moved through the combat without the half-second of processing delay that training always left. Pure instinct, layered over 10 years of disciplined practice, produced something that was faster than either alone. She felt the wall break around her. Not through her, around her. The fighters on either side peeling back from the impact of the Dragon Pack fighters hitting the same line simultaneously at multiple points. The center folded in 40 seconds. Bren's reserve fed forward exactly as planned, directly into the collapsed center. But the center had already moved through, and the reserve hit a gap that was filled not with the front rank they were meant to reinforce, but with the second rank of Lyra's formation coming through behind her. They hit the reserve at the worst angle, from partially inside the formation structure, and the reserve's cohesion broke within a minute. She came through the second line onto the ridge and stopped. The Iron Fang Palace was visible from here. 3 miles northwest, the towers catching the flat gray light. The walls she had walked inside for 11 years standing against the sky like a statement she had never finished making. Bren was 30 feet away. He had held with his personal guard rather than running, which she had expected because she had never seen Bren run from anything and had always respected it more than she wanted to. He was bleeding from his side, not badly, but enough. He looked at her across the broken ridge with the expression of a man who had put his best plan against hers and watched his best plan lose and was now doing the accounting. "Ashbourne," he said. It was the first time anyone from the Iron Fang court had used that name in 10 years in her hearing. She let it land. "Lord Commander." He looked at the formation behind her, at the Dragon Pack shimmer at the edges of her fighters, at her armor, the scale pattern plates, the blood on her gauntlet. He was doing what he always did, reading a situation completely before saying anything about it. "The king doesn't know it's you," he said. "I know." "If I tell him," she said. "That's not a threat. I'm telling you to tell him. I want him to know exactly who's 3 miles from his gate before I get there." She held Bren's gaze. "I want him to have time to decide what he's going to do with that information. That's not mercy, it's accuracy." Bren was quiet for a moment. The fighting around them had stopped. His remaining fighters had laid down arms, which was the correct decision, and she would ensure they were treated accordingly. "He's not the same man," Bren said finally. "It was not a defense. It was something else. Vane ran the council for 7 years. Kalen, he's been trying to pull it back. He's been—" Bren stopped, set his jaw. "I'm not asking you to forgive anything. I'm telling you the picture isn't what it was." "I know what the picture is," she said. "I've been looking at it for 10 years. She turned to Rael. "Secure the ridge. Wounded first, theirs and ours. Then move the formation to the palace perimeter." She looked back at Bren. "Walk with me or don't? Your choice." He walked with her. The palace gate was closed when she reached the perimeter. She stood with the formation behind her and looked at the walls and felt nothing particularly dramatic about the sight of them, just the flat assessment of a structure she needed to get through. Then the gate opened. Not because she had demanded it. It opened from the inside, both heavy iron doors moving on their mechanisms with the deliberate weight of a choice, and in the gap that opened between them stood Kaelin Draven, alone, in no armor and no ceremonial clothes, just the plain dark coat he wore in the training yard, the one she recognized because she had seen it every morning for 3 years from the window of the war room while she worked. He walked out through the gate and stopped 20 feet from her. He looked at her armor, at the formation behind her, at her face for a long time. She waited. "I knew," he said. His voice was low and controlled, and she could hear what it was costing him to keep it that way. When Bren's rider described the commander, I knew before he finished the sentence. And he breathed in. His jaw was tight. His hands were at his sides, and she could see from 20 feet that they were not entirely steady. "And I opened the gate." She looked at him. Really looked. At what 10 years had done to the man who had turned his back on her in the torchlight. He was older. There was gray at his temples. He carried something in his face that she recognized, not because she had seen it in him before, but because she had felt the shape of it herself in the dragon wild. The specific weight of someone who has had a long time to sit with a wrong they cannot undo. She had not come here for this. She had not come here for him. She had come here for Vayne, and for the kingdom's eastern corridor, and for the 1,400 fighters behind her who needed what she had promised them. She had come here because she had built something in the valley, and she intended to keep it. But she was here now, and he was 20 feet away with his hands not entirely steady, and the gate was open behind him. "Where is Vayne?" she said. Something moved in Kaelin's face. Northern Council Chamber, with 6 of the senior nobles. "They convened this morning when the rider brought word of your advance," he paused. "They don't know it's you. They think they're managing an external threat." "They are managing an external threat," she said. "Yes." He held her gaze. "But not the kind they're planning for." She looked at the open gate, at the palace beyond it, at Kaelin standing between them, alone, having walked out of his own walls to face her without armor or escort. There were things she had prepared to say at this moment. She had prepared them over months with the particular care she gave to tactical briefs. Not speeches, not grievances, just clear statements of fact and requirement. She had prepared for a closed gate, and a defensive position, and a negotiation conducted from strength. She had not prepared for him to simply open the door. "I need Vayne," she said. "I need the council chamber, and I need Vayne inside it when I arrive. And I need every noble in that room to stay in that room." She looked at him steadily. "Can you do that?" A beat of silence. "Yes," he said. "Then move." She looked past him at the gate. "I'm right behind you." He turned and walked back through the gate into his own palace, and she followed him through, and the formation came through behind her with a sound like the earth shifting, and the iron doors stayed open, and inside the walls of the Iron Fang Palace, the walls she had walked in for 11 years and out of in a single night, the Northern Council Chamber waited at the end of a long corridor with 6 men in it who believed they were still the ones deciding how this day ended. They had approximately 3 minutes left to believe that. She moved through the palace corridor at pace, Rael and Cass flanking, the Dragon Pack fighters spreading through the building's access points with the silent efficiency of people who had been briefed. The corridor was familiar under her boots and completely different, both at once, the way things are when you return to a place that shaped you after you have been shaped into something it did not anticipate. The council chamber door was iron-banded oak. She hit it at full stride and it came open, and she walked into the room, and the 6 nobles and Lord Vayne looked up from the table and the room went completely, absolutely still. Vayne recognized her in the first second. She could see it happen. The precise moment his face went from the controlled authority of a man managing a crisis to something underneath that he had not shown in a long time, something that looked briefly and completely like fear. She stopped at the head of the table. "Lord Vayne," she said, "you have a great deal to answer for." The council chamber held its silence for a long time. Vayne was the first to break it, which was predictable. He was a man who had survived decades of court politics by never letting silence work against him, by filling it before it could be used as a weapon. He straightened in his chair and put his hands flat on the table and arranged his face into something that was almost composure. Lyra Ashbourne, he said. You're supposed to be dead. I know, she said. That was your plan. She did not move from the head of the table. She did not need to. The room's geometry had already done the work. 6 nobles and Vane on one side of it, her at the head, Rael and Cass at the door, and Kaelin standing at the wall to her left where he had positioned himself when they entered. Not at the table. Not with Vane. At the wall, separate, which was the first honest positioning she had seen from him in the 3 minutes since the gate. One of the nobles, Lord Pell, she remembered him, young and careful and perpetually calculating which side of any given situation was winning, started to rise from his chair. Stay seated, she said. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. He stayed seated. The forged prophecy, she said. She was looking at Vane. I want to hear you explain it, not deny it. Explain it. There's a difference, and I'll know which one you're doing. Vane looked at her for a moment with the assessment of a man deciding what version of the truth was still survivable. The bonding ceremony was managed, he said finally. The ceremonialist was given a compound in his preparation materials that suppressed the spirit call response. It's a known substance, old, rare, not widely documented. It doesn't eliminate a wolf spirit. It creates a surface disruption, enough to make a call fail in public. The room was very still. Several of the nobles were looking at the table, not at Vane, not at her, at the table, with the specific attention of people who had known and said nothing. Why? She said. Because you were a problem. He said it without inflection, which was somehow worse than if he'd been defensive about it. You had too much reach, the Eastern Intelligence Network, the council relationships, the kings. He stopped, chose a different word. Influence. You were not controllable. Women in your position in Iron Fang history have always been controllable. You were not. So you built a ceremony around removing me. I built a ceremony around a legal mechanism that already existed, he said. I didn't invent the law. I used it. She looked at him for a long moment. This was the thing about Vane. He was not a stupid man, and he was not, in his own accounting, a cruel one. He was a man who had decided very early that the kingdom was a structure to be managed, and that the people inside it were variables in that management, and that the distinction between using a person and destroying one was primarily a matter of efficiency. She had dealt with men like him in the council rooms. She had outmaneuvered them. She had never, until now, had the standing to make them answer for it directly. The forged prophecy, she said again, the one that told Kaelin I was weak, that told the court my bloodline was a liability. A pause. Yes. Who wrote it? I did. He held her gaze. With the assistance of Elder Morn, who has since died of natural causes. The text was placed in the archive 18 months before the bonding ceremony, long enough to feel established. She heard Kaelin make a sound at the wall. Not words. Something lower than words. The specific noise a person makes when something they had suspected becomes something they know, and the knowing is worse than the suspecting. She did not look at Kaelin. Not yet. The nobles in this room, she said. Which of you knew? Silence. Then Lord Pell, who was young and calculating and apparently had done his calculation. We knew the ceremony was managed. We were not told the mechanism. He glanced at Vane. We were told you had been assessed and found unsuitable, that the ceremony would confirm it. Assessed by whom? By Lord Vane's office. And none of you asked to see the assessment. No answer. Which was its own answer. She looked at them. The 6 of them, Pell and the 5 others, men who had sat in these rooms and made decisions and allowed a thing to happen because it was convenient and because questioning Vane was its own kind of risk. She had spent 11 years in rooms with men like these. She understood them with the particular clarity of someone who had been their colleague and then their casualty. Stand up, she said. They stood. You will remain in this chamber under Dragon Pack guard until the full council can be convened. At that convening, every document in Lord Vane's office will be read into the public record. Every member of this court will hear what was done and by whom and why. That is not a negotiation. That is what happens next. She looked at Vane last. And you, she said, you'll be present for all of it. Something moved in his face. Not fear exactly, but the specific collapse of a long confidence. The confidence of a man who had managed every situation for decades and had simply, finally, run out of room to manage. You can't prove all of it, he said. It was not a challenge. It was a fact, delivered flatly by a man who was trying to understand the shape of what remained. I don't need to prove all of it, she said. I need to prove enough. And I have 10 years of documentation that you didn't know I was keeping because you thought I was dead. She let that settle. I kept very good records in the Dragonwild, Lord Vane. I had a great deal of time. She turned from the table and walked to the door, and Rael and Cass moved to cover the chamber without being told. At the door she stopped and turned back, not to Vane, but to the room in general. If anyone in this chamber makes any attempt to communicate outside it before the council convenes, the Dragon Pack fighters currently positioned at every exit of this palace will treat it as a hostile act. I'd encourage you to spend the time thinking clearly about what you want to say when you're given the chance to say it publicly. She looked at Pell specifically. Some of you might find the truth is lighter than you expect. She walked out. But Kaelin found her in the eastern courtyard 20 minutes later. She had gone there not for any tactical reason, but because it was where she had always gone when she needed to think without being observed. A narrow stone space between the residential wing and the old armory, open to the sky, too awkward for social use and too small for training. She had eaten lunch alone there dozens of times over 11 years. She had not expected to remember the way there without thinking. Her feet had taken her without consultation. She heard him come through the side passage and did not turn around. He stopped 10 feet behind her. She could hear his breathing, slightly uneven, which for Kaelin meant something significant, because his control over his own physical presentation was normally absolute. The ceremonialist, he said. I had trusted him for 15 years. I know. The prophecy was in the archive. I read it myself. I thought... He stopped. The sentence had somewhere it couldn't go. I thought I was making a decision based on real information. You were making a decision based on information that had been constructed to produce a specific decision, she said. That's different. And also, she turned around. Also not entirely the same thing as being innocent of it. He held her gaze. He did not flinch from it. That, at least, was still him. No, he said, it's not. She looked at him in the gray afternoon light of the courtyard she had eaten lunch in for 11 years. The man she had watched for 3 of those years with the specific attention of someone who saw more in him than he showed, who had believed that the reaching she'd glimpsed was real and worth something. She looked at what a decade had done to that belief, and what it had done to him, and what standing in this courtyard again was doing to her. She was not the woman who had stood in the calling circle. She had known that from the moment she walked through the palace gate, known it in the way her body moved through the familiar spaces without the deference it had once carried, without the constant background awareness of who was watching and what they were deciding. She had walked through this palace like someone who owned it, not because she intended to claim it, but because 10 years in the Dragonwild had removed the reflex of making herself smaller in rooms that other people had built. But she was also not someone who had stopped being affected by the things that had happened in it. You turned your back, she said, at the circle. You had already decided when you spoke. I could see it. Yes. And Vane had already placed the prophecy. He had already arranged the compound. By the time you stood there, the decision had been made for you 6 months in advance, and you didn't know it. She looked at him steadily. That's true. And also, I watched your face, Kaelin, before Vane put his hand on your shoulder. There was a moment where you could have stopped it, where you chose not to. He said nothing. His jaw was tight. You were afraid, she said. Not an accusation, a fact. Not of me, of what having a mate whose wolf didn't perform meant for the kingdom's perception of your strength. That's what Vane built on. He didn't create the fear, he used what was already there. Yes. The word came out stripped of everything around it. Yes, that's true. She breathed in slowly. I'm not here to punish you for it, she said. I want to be clear about that. What I'm doing, The council convening, Vane's records, the public accounting. That's not punishment. That's correction. The kingdom ran on a lie for 10 years. The lie needs to be dismantled in the same place it was built, in front of the same people who watched it happen. I know. He looked at his hands for a moment, then back at her. And the crown. She had been waiting for him to get there. What about it? She said. I want to surrender it. He said it clearly, without theater. Formally, to the full council, publicly, with the accounting. Not because you're forcing me to, because... He stopped, and for a moment she saw the thing that reached, the thing she had glimpsed in the war councils years ago, closer to the surface than it had ever been. Because the only way the kingdom believes the accounting is if I'm part of it, not managing it from the throne. In it, accountable for my part. She looked at him for a long time. That's the most honest thing I've ever heard you say, she said. Something in his face shifted. Not relief, not quite. Something older than relief. The specific easing of a man who has been carrying a weight he was not sure he'd ever be able to put down. What happens after, he said. To the kingdom. The council will need restructuring. The eastern border requires real territorial agreements, not just Iron Fang assertion. The Dragon Pack's territory needs formal recognition. They've been erased from the maps for 40 years, and that ends. She paused. And the law that Vane used, the bonding display requirement, it goes. All of it. All of it. Strength isn't a performance. It took me 10 years in a valley that doesn't appear on your maps to understand that clearly enough to say it out loud. She looked at the courtyard walls. This kingdom has been measuring the wrong things for a long time. That's not unique to you or Vane. It goes back further. But it changes now because now someone is here who can change it. You, he said. She looked at him. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. I'm not asking for something, he said carefully. I want to be clear about that. I'm not... What I did can't be undone by asking. I understand that. His voice was controlled, and she could hear, underneath the control, something that was simply true. But I need you to know that I... He stopped, started again. 10 years is a long time to understand what you lost. She held his gaze for a long moment. The courtyard was silent. Somewhere above the residential wing, a gust of wind moved across the stone and was gone. I know, she said. Not warmly, not coldly, honestly. I need you to understand something in return. She took a step toward him, not closing the distance entirely, but making it deliberate. What I thought we were building. I don't know what was real and what Vane constructed. And I don't think you know either. Trust doesn't rebuild from not knowing. It rebuilds from something new, if it rebuilds at all. She held his gaze. I'm not closing a door. I'm telling you where the door actually is. He nodded once. It was enough. The full council convened 3 days later. Lyra sat at the head of the council table, not in ceremony, not in the formal chair that the Alpha King's seat traditionally occupied, but in a working chair pulled to the table's head, with Vialor on her left and Orin on her right, and Rael behind her taking notes. She had decided on the seating arrangement herself, and she had decided it the way she decided everything, by thinking about what it meant, not just what it looked like. The records from Vane's office took 4 hours to read into the public record. She listened to all of it, and she watched the faces of the assembled nobles as they listened, the ones who had known and the ones who hadn't, both of whom had something to sit with. Lord Pell had taken her suggestion. When the council reached the section on the bonding ceremony compound, he stood without being asked and confirmed what he had known and stated clearly what he had failed to do with that knowledge. It was not a comfortable statement to make in public. He made it anyway. She noted it without comment. Vane sat through all of it without speaking until he was directly addressed. When he was asked to confirm or deny each recorded item, he confirmed them, flatly and completely, with the flat delivery of a man who had made a calculation and was executing it. She did not know what the calculation was. It didn't matter. The record was the record. Kaelin surrendered the crown formally, at the council's midpoint, before the full assembled body. He spoke for 4 minutes without notes. He did not minimize. He did not explain. He said what had been done and what his part in it was and what he believed that required of him. The room was very quiet while he spoke. She watched his face while he said it. She watched him mean it. Afterward, when the council had adjourned and the chamber was clearing, Bren found her in the corridor outside. "The Eastern Border Units," he said. "They're waiting on disposition orders." "Integrate them into the Joint Command structure," she said. "Your command stays, Bren, reporting to the new council structure, not to a single alpha." She paused. "You built good soldiers. That doesn't go away because the leadership above you was corrupted." He looked at her for a moment. "You knew when you walked the map into the war room 20 years ago." 19, she said. 19. A pause. "I laughed." "You read it twice," she said. "That's the part I kept." Something shifted in his weathered face, brief and not comfortable, the look of a man recalibrating a long-held accounting. "Yes," he said. "I did." He walked away down the corridor. She watched him go. The coronation was not a ceremony in the traditional sense, because she had declined the traditional form, the calling circle, the spirit invocation, the public display. She had replaced it with something simpler, a formal council ratification, conducted in the open courtyard of the palace with every member of the assembled alliance present. Dragon Pack fighters standing alongside Iron Fang soldiers, Orin Southern Wolves and the Eastern Border Neutrals, who had marched under her command and now stood witness to what they had marched for. Valor placed the High Alpha's mark on her armor himself, a dragon-scale sigil, not a crown, something that could be worn into the field, not just displayed in ceremony. He was precise about it, the way he was precise about everything, and when it was done he stepped back and looked at her with the expression she had first seen from him at the Dragonwild tree line, the door testing its hinge. "The valley will be different without you," he said. "The valley doesn't need me anymore," she said. "It built me, and now it has what it built me into. That's what the valley was always for." He was quiet for a moment. "Your mother would have understood you." She breathed in slowly. "I know." A pause. "I wish I'd had time to understand her first." He nodded. That was all. She walked to the courtyard's open center, the one that was not a calling circle and would never be again, just open stone under open sky. And she stood where the Alliance could see her, and she felt the heat in her chest sitting steady at its anchor point, present and quiet in hers. Not performing, not displaying, not asking to be recognized by any ritual or any law or any man's accounting of what strength was supposed to look like. Just here, just certain. She thought about the receiving room with the single oil lamp, the canvas pack, the compass, the 60 seconds she had allowed herself in the dark before walking out. She thought about 2 days in the Ashen Pass, navigating by texture and wind direction, and the specific stubbornness of a woman who had decided that dying in the direction she'd been pointed was less interesting than finding out what was on the other side. The things that had been taken from her were real. She did not minimize them or reframe them into gifts. They had been losses, specific and costly, and the person she had been in the calling circle had deserved better than what she got. That truth did not become less true because of what the loss had made room for. Both were true simultaneously. She had learned, somewhere in the second year of the Dragonwild, that the ability to hold two true things without needing one of them to cancel the other was not wisdom exactly. It was just survival, practiced long enough to become a way of seeing. Kaelin was standing at the courtyard's edge, not in the assembly, not at her side. At the edge, in the plain dark coat, watching. Their eyes met for a moment across the open stone. She did not look away, and neither did he. What they had been was gone. What might come next was not yet anything. Not a promise, not a certainty, not a story with a shape. It was a specific condition of two people who had been through enough to know that starting something new was not the same as returning to something old, and that the difference mattered more than the wanting did. She looked away first, not because she needed to, but because there was work in front of her, and the work was the point. She turned to face the assembled alliance, 1,400 fighters and 300 Dragon Pack warriors, and the full Iron Fang Council, and the Eastern Border Packs, and the neutral wolves who had come in from the Rim Zone and were standing in a palace courtyard for the first time, looking at the walls with the expressions of people who were deciding whether to trust the space. She would give them reason to trust it, not through display, through the slow, unglamorous, daily work of building an institution that measured the right things, through law that accounted for what it couldn't yet see, through the specific patience of someone who had learned, in a valley that didn't appear on any map, that the most durable things were the ones built without an audience. "We have work to do," she said. No speech, no ceremony, just that. And the courtyard answered in the only way that mattered, the shuffle and reset of 1,400 people turning toward what came next, the sound of a force that had fought together deciding, collectively, that the fighting was over and the building had begun. Above the palace walls, the sky held flat and gray and endless. Somewhere in it, if you knew how to look, the Ashen Mountains were visible on the eastern horizon, pale and permanent, the border between the world that had cast her out and the world that had made her. She did not look at them. She was already moving.